Okay, so now turning to our incredible speaker today, it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Michael Eisen. Michael is currently a professor of genetics and development in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology at UC Berkeley, where he and his group work on animal embryo development using computational, experimental, and evolutionary genomics techniques with Drosophila. Dr. Eisen did his PhD at Harvard with the legendary Don Wiley, and then moved to the West Coast and did a postdoc with Patrick Brown and David Bostein at Stanford. But more to the point of what I think he'll be talking about today, Michael has been at the forefront of pushing for scientific research and publishing, particularly in the life sciences, to be a universally open and accessible public good. Perhaps most notably, Michael helped found the Public Library of Science, PLOS, which both publishes and advocates for open access science. He was recognized for this work and his other open access software with the 2002 Benjamin Franklin Award for Open Access in the Life Sciences. He has also been at the forefront of calling for a reimagining of the process of peer review in science, and is currently the editor-in-chief at eLife, a journal that is changing the game of peer review by only reviewing articles that are available as preprints and making peer review faster, fairer, and more open. Michael really is one of the most outspoken and active advocates for a better and more open scientific culture in research and publishing, and I'm so excited to hear his talk today. As an early career researcher, it's really inspiring to see folks like Michael really push forward on these types of topics that make the future of doing science seem more like a place that we actually want to be and that works in favor of scientists and the public good. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks to you all for inviting me. This is the kind of group I really like to talk to, since we're sort of all on the same page, I think, and have the bigger question of kind of how do we accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm gonna do a little bit of history and a little bit of sort of forward-looking, thinking about where we need to go as a field. But just to frame my own thinking about this, if you look back at the history of the internet, and really what we're all talking about here is kind of how to make sure that science takes advantage of the internet in productive and useful ways, and not kind of squander the opportunity. Remember, the internet was literally invented to help scientists communicate with each other. I mean, the purposes may have been to promote sharing of information about the defense industry, but the real kind of goal that the people who invented the internet were trying to solve was to make it easier for scientists at initially different institutions in the US, but ultimately the world, to share data and insights that they were collecting. And you zoom forward 50 years since the internet was invented, and it has changed almost every aspect of our lives, right? Like the fact is, I can watch a sporting event that takes place all across the world on my phone, and there's just no aspect of our lives that hasn't been fundamentally transformed by the internet, except science communication. I mean, in some ways, it's the most stunning thing that science communication has been I would say, one of the most resistant things to change due to the internet, right? Papers look more or less the same as they did before the internet was constructed. We still think about how we communicate with a fundamental unit of a paper, which is a print era artifact. That remains the kind of ultimate production of science, is something that was invented 350 years ago. We're really stuck in this era of pre-internet communication. I would say, in many ways, we're stuck in an era of a centuries old means of communication, right? The scientific journal was invented in the 17th century to make it easier for the various scientists who were part of the Royal Society in Britain to communicate with each other, if their horse got sick and they couldn't ride from Scotland or whatever. And the basic, things are different. We have color figures, there's other things about our papers, but the basic means of communication has been remarkably stable over those 300 some odd years. This is like I always like to think about people from the era of the early scientific journal coming to modern society. So this is Francis Bacon, who was sort of integrally involved in the invention of scientific journals. If they came to the modern world, it's hard to imagine anything being comfortable for them, right? Like every aspect of life, of technology, of things we do in the world would be alienating and freaky, and would I think they would be stunned by, except scientific journals, right? They could go to a library and find the same kind of structure, the same kind of means of communication that they were used to 350 years ago. And it should embarrass us that we have that's true. Okay, so I'm going to tick through. I think people think about these things, but it's worth articulating. I think in advance why it's so important that we change this system. So when I look at the system of scientific publishing and ask what's wrong with it, I get a pretty straightforward answer, which is like almost everything. There are things about it that are valuable and useful, and I know Amelia's gonna jump on me at the end of this talk to try to defend journals. But if you look at the way we communicate with each other, I think it's fundamentally broken at nearly every level, right? The thing that drew me into this problem was the fact that the scientific literature is restricted. Even today, where half of the world's population has an internet connection, a tiny fraction of those people have meaningful access to the scientific and medical literature. I should probably say meaningful legal access nowadays because of things like Sci-Hub. But the fact is, most researchers, most physicians, most teachers, let alone most members of the public, don't have meaningful access to the scientific literature. And that's just totally ridiculous that remains true. The system is incredibly slow, right? The process of getting an article published, it's one of the most sort of stunning analyses I ever did in my life was looking at the time it took to publish articles in the pre-internet era to the post-internet era. And if you look at journals that sort of span that divide from that published before the internet came along to after, they are on average 2 months slower at publishing articles than they were before the internet came along. And that's despite the fact that we no longer have to print out copies of papers and mail them to reviewers who have to mail reviews back. Like all sorts of efficiencies, ostensible efficiencies have been introduced into the process, and yet the process itself remains ridiculously slow. Nowadays in biology, if you look at publication rates, it takes about 9 months for a paper to go from submission to publication. And this, if you believe in science and you believe that the accumulated benefits of scientific research help the world, you have to think that the delays in publication impair societal benefit from science. It's a direct corollary of these delays. I always like to point out that the 9 months it takes to publish a typical paper is about the same amount of time it takes to launch a rover from Earth and send it all the way to Mars and have it land on the surface of Mars. I'll come back to this later, but if you wanted to design a publishing system that was based upon printing out every work of science that was produced in the world on paper, putting them into rocket ships loaded up with rovers like this one, and sent them to Mars, had that rover land on the surface of Mars and scatter the papers all over the surface of the planet, and then take pictures of those papers and beam them back to Earth. This would actually take about the same amount of time that it takes to publish a typical scientific paper. And as I'll come back to later, the most astonishing thing is it would be cheaper. That is, it would be cheaper to print out and launch every single paper that's published in a given year to Mars with a rover and have the rover send pictures back to Earth than it is to run the current scientific publishing system. Okay, so I kind of alluded to this before, but the process is it's remarkably static, right? The changes that there are in the scientific literature are largely unimportant. There's like, color figures and smaller fonts and things like that. But the fundamental structure that we use for communicating our information has remained the same over the centuries and has almost completely failed to take advantage of the technology we have in front of us. The system is incredibly convoluted. We have something like 50,000 scientific journals in the world today, and papers have to go from one journal, they get submitted to a journal, they go through weird layers of peer review. Often they go to another journal and go through the weird layers of peer review again. Choices about what journal to send your paper to are fraught and complicated, and often there's a lot of disagreement. The way money gets transferred from the people who support science to the institutions that actually carry out peer review and publishing is Byzantine and ineffective and ridiculously inefficient. As I mentioned, that system is incredibly expensive. Science as a whole spends about $10 billion a year, or about $5,000 for every paper that we publish. And what we get for that is a kind of outdated product, right? This $10 billion a year is, it can send a lot of rocket ships to Mars, which is a good way of thinking about it. And I would say the system doesn't really work like we want it to. The kind of sole kind of germ of importance that there is in this process is peer review, and I'll come back to this later. But I would argue that even with something as central to science as peer review, the system does a pretty poor job, as is evinced by the fact that lots of really bad articles get through peer review, and we don't have we are not using all the kind of technology and protocols that exist on the internet to try to make this system of peer review more efficient, more democratic, more inclusive than it currently is. The system is ridiculously biased. It's biased in sort of every way that society is biased, and has invented some new ways to be biased. It's not a fair system. It heavily favors people with money at big institutions in the developed world. It favors men over women. It favors white scientists over minority scientists. It's kind of every problem we have with equity in science is amplified, not reversed by the publishing system. And I think fundamentally it distorts the way that science is executed. In many circles of the world, the pursuit of publication in top journals is the goal of science. It has become the thing that drives and motivates a lot of science, because it's the thing that determines how people succeed as scientists in the world. So I would say that it's just sort of a fundamentally broken system, right? If you want to throw all that aside, like basically we pay publishers $10 billion a year to oversee a process of publishing content that they did not create. They didn't fund its creation. They didn't really play a role in its creation. Scientists do all of the critical work, mostly for free. And what we get for that is a slow system that provides like very incomplete access to a very outdated product that isn't particularly reliable, and that alters the way that science careers are developed, what kind of science people do, and so forth. So I would say the system should have been thrown out the instant the internet was created. And the interesting question and challenge is why? Why do we still have this system, and why has it been so difficult to innovate and do new things in this world? Okay, and it's particularly galling because it obviously doesn't have to be this way, right? Other parts of science, like the physics community, even before the modern internet came along, almost all papers in physics were being shared in a different way, right? Starting in 1992, the physicists set up a website. Initially, it was on the pre-browser internet, but there was a place you could go where you could upload and then correspondingly download for completely free, basically any paper that was written by people in physics and the aligned fields. And so the fact that the physicists demonstrated that this could be done makes it even more astonishing that we haven't really succeeded in doing that in physics. It's kind of a little, I think, funny part of early internet history that the initial website on which the physics preprint archive existed was xxx.lanl.gov, because that was lexigraphically after www.lanl.gov. Obviously, that has had to be changed over time, but that was when the internet was a purer place. We blew our chance to do this. This is kind of, these are all things that were going on in the world in 1996, right, when the internet was invented. We had an opportunity that back then to fundamentally change the way that publishing happened in biology. You know, I dabble in ecology and evolution, but I'm fundamentally a molecular biologist, and so my life is dominated by the decisions of the NIH. And back in the early days of the internet, in the early days of internet publishing, the then director of the NIH, Harold Varmus, realized that this was a problem, and he proposed a solution that was inspired by the physics archive, that would basically have created a national, or would have been an international archive of the scientific literature run by the NIH, completely funded by the NIH, and free to everybody to participate in as an author or a reader. And if you look back at this proposal, which has been lost to history because it was never fully implemented, it would have completely altered the way that publishing in biology, or at least in biomedicine, happened. And it would have done some important things like place a decision of when to share work in the hands of authors, something we get with preprints. It would have provided immediate free access to the scientific literature to anyone, anywhere in the world with an internet connection. It would have streamlined the process of peer review and made it far more effective. And I think it also would have recognized something that has been a big problem for us in the field, which is the vital interests of funders, have in optimizing how their work is shared, not just how it's conducted. Basically, it would have replaced this convoluted thing I showed you before with the system we should have, which is a world where authors decide when to share their work, readers can get access to it immediately and for free, that peer review happens on top of an already published literature, and that the whole system is funded directly by the NIH and other research funders, so that nobody who's participating in it ever has to pay a transaction cost or faces any kind of financial barrier to participation. So this is what we should have. Why don't we have it? And we don't have it because when that system was proposed, the societies that dominate the discourse around science in the US, at least, the big nonprofit scientific societies, who also happen to be publishers of highly lucrative journals, just lobbied to have it killed, and were successful in lobbying Congress to have this system killed. And as a result of that effort to stymie government action to change scientific publishing, this is sort of where I got involved in the process. The whole notion of open access journals was born. And I'm not actually going to spend a ton of time on open access because I want to look even beyond that. But just to remind you, right, the obstacle we faced initially was that there were a bunch of journals that were making tons and tons of money on subscription journals. Their financial interest in those journals was leading them to make decisions that we felt were counter to the broader interests of science in the public in terms of access to the literature. And so we felt it was important that we change the fundamental economics of science publishing, getting away from a subscription model that kind of gives way too much financial power to the journals that are publishing papers, into this open access model that, at least in its initial conception, was meant to be a simple way for funders to fund the publishing of the work that the scientists they fund created, in a way that made it possible to make it freely available to the world. Right. The fundamental idea here is that rather than cover the cost of publishing by subscriptions, which fundamentally necessitate paywalls, then it's better to just pay up front to allow the work to be freely available to all. It's a simple concept that's been somewhat hard to implement for various reasons that I want to talk about. But just to the way we think about that that model is of kind of thinking about an obstetrician delivering a baby, right? That the dominant, still dominant journal publishing economics is one would be akin to an obstetrician, who obviously plays an important role in kind of making sure a baby's birth is healthy and safe for everybody involved, but isn't really the fundamentally key participant in creating a baby. They're just there at the end and they make sure the process goes well, kind of like journals do with communicating scientific papers. An obstetrician could make a considerable fortune by claiming ownership of the baby that they deliver at the end of the process, and then leasing it back to the parents. Kind of the parents would have to pay or would be willing to pay whatever they could afford to get access to their own child. The obstetrician could essentially set prices arbitrarily as long as there was enough money to pay for them. It's a great system for the obstetrician, but it's obviously not something that parents would want to participate in or that we should sanction. And yet we basically do the same thing with scientific publishing. So our thinking in this process was, well, this economic system is so fundamentally flawed that if we replace it with something that's much saner, that this would lead to a reinvention of the way that publishing works with respect to science. And it has worked to some extent. Open access has grown. There are more and more articles that are available via open access journals of one flavor or another. But we're 20 plus years into this, and we're still not yet at even half of the articles that are published in biology being available for free on the internet. And many of the ones that are done in this kind of convoluted way, it really hasn't worked. And so the question that I think we should all be asking is, why don't things like this work? What has been the obstacle to innovation in this space to make science more open? And I think in this case, it's easy to point to the culprit, which is, things didn't change the way that we wanted them to. I think some of the things have been maybe predictable in that the system has been corrupted. People who make lots of money on something will figure out ways to make money no matter how much you try to change it, right? I think people will know that Nature has decided to become to allow people to publish their articles in an open access way, but the charge is just absurd, right? It's like $12,000 to make your paper free to read. It's not within scope for most researchers to do anything like that. So it's a perversion of what we originally intended this system to accomplish. But also, like, we really made a mistake in our way that we were thinking about this, right? That we thought that the problem in science publishing was just fundamentally about economics, right? And we tried to fix a problem. The problem we tried to fix was that people had to pay to get access to scientific articles, which we thought was just, was so glaringly, obviously a problem that we thought that this was the problem that needed to be solved. And by the way, it is a huge problem. It remains a huge problem. I don't regret trying to solve that problem, but in many ways, we didn't fix the core issue, right? The core problem isn't really that how we fund journals. The core problem is that we have journals, and I'm more and more convinced that the process we took, and I think there's probably a broad lesson here. The process we took to try to fix the system from within was never going to work. That really reforming these systems requires kind of a radical restructuring, right? And I think as scientists, you probably know this, but we are really addicted as scientists to journals, in particular to journal titles, right? I spend a lot of time with scientists, and even though they know that, like, that Science, Nature, and Cell are like the worst words you can utter to me, they continue to talk about their scientific achievements as being equivalent to where they publish their papers. People highlight they describe their own work and their own scientific achievements in terms of the journals in which they are published, right? And I think that we really have a pathology in science writ large that we do that we don't look fundamentally at the value of the work through any other lens than where that work is published. And that's true for lots of reasons. Sort of, it's part of the culture of science, but it's also part of the culture of science careers, right? In so many parts of the world, getting a job, getting funded, getting promoted is if not explicitly determined by where you publish, it's implicitly determined by where you publish. And that fact has made it virtually impossible to change the publishing system in an incremental way. It needs to be radically restructured, right? I've talked to probably 10,000 scientists over the years about publishing. I've run into maybe 2 or 3 who disagree that the system is broken. They mostly agree that there's all these things I've talked about are problems. And yet when push comes to shove, if changing the system requires that they renounce publishing in high impact journals, they won't do it. Okay. And that fact empowers all the extortionist prices and all the other problems we have in publishing. It's sort of the problems fundamentally derived from scientists being unwilling and unable to break out of the system. So if the existence of journals makes it impossible to make science publishing journal better, we should ask ourselves the question, do we actually need them, right? The fundamental thing that changed with the internet more than anything else is that publishing stopped being something that someone else had to do, right? The process of making your work public, back when I was a graduate student and we were sharing things in journals, I had no capacity to print my work out, to mail it to anybody who might want a copy of that paper. I could have done it, but it would have taken all of my time and it would have taken resources I didn't have, right? As soon as the internet comes along, the process of sharing your work shifted from a system, a business, a complex infrastructure to just pressing a button. And yes, obviously there's some infrastructure that's required to make the internet work, but it's not something that you have to worry about as an author. And I love this quote from this writer, Clay Shirky, that the publishing is no longer an industry. It's no longer a group of professionals. Publishing is a button. And we really need to start thinking about that more fundamentally in the world of science. So, I think everybody now knows that this is starting to happen in biology finally, and much belatedly. We've had finally a preprint server that's taken off in biology, and many of you are probably using it and as authors and readers. The submissions to preprint servers have gone through the roof. I think it's safe to say that preprinting now is here to stay, and that is actually accomplishing many of the things that we wanted to accomplish. Preprinting is fast. It's still, at least for now, it's free. It's got a lot of advantages, and I think everybody is starting to realize that. The problem that everybody always talks about when we talk about preprints and that world of kind of author-directed publishing is, what do we do about peer review? And I think kind of the way we're thinking about things moving forward is that this whole idea that has long equated the process of peer review and assessment of the scientific literature with journals, that is the core problem that we need to fix. And a new kind of model is emerging, but is not yet really in existence, which posits a fundamental reorganization of the way that publishing and peer review are related to each other. And the basic notion is we should all just publish our work first. The fundamental act of publishing should not be something that journals do. This is something that authors should do. When you're ready to share your work, you press a button and it is shared with the world. And then we collectively, mechanisms as yet not fully fleshed out, we review and curate that work, but not in the context of deciding what should and shouldn't be published, but in the context of deciding how we can usefully review and curate papers. That is, divorce this review and curate part of the world from the publishing part of the world. Right. So the published part, that's done, bioarchive. The review part is starting to emerge. So I don't know how many of you pay attention to the fact that eLife, which I'm now editor-in-chief of, and other places are starting to review preprints directly on bioarchive. So we have, it's not a fundamental shift in how we operate, but we now do something that I think is radically different, which is, first of all, we no longer review papers if they're not posted as preprints. That is, if you submit a paper to eLife and it's not posted as a preprint, You either have to agree to post it as a preprint or we won't review it. And the reason is not to force people to post preprints, but it's because we want to do this for every paper that we assess, which is there's a preprint and we add a review alongside the preprint. And we write the review not necessarily just for the authors. We have a whole separate thing where we'll send the authors communications, but trying to write reviews for the audience of people who are reading the paper, who might want to read the paper, and so forth. This is very much in its infancy, but this is the way the world should evolve. We should have papers published on preprint servers, and then they should get reviewed. They should get reviewed by organizations like eLife, which is sort of what journals are going to kind of become. We pick papers we're interested in, we review them. If some other organization or some individual wants to review the paper, they should review the paper too. This whole idea that we can solve all the goals of peer review by reviewing papers by one organization with 2 or 3 reviewers at one fixed point in time and render a permanent judgment about the value and quality of the science, that's just, it's obviously not the right way to do things. And this is the way I think we're going to evolve. We don't know. There's a lot still to be worked out about how to do this well, what kind of structures need to be put in place, how to do it fairly, how to make sure that people don't, that we don't manifest all the pathologies of the internet on preprint review. But it is starting, and I think if we're successful in doing this, it's going to fundamentally reshape the relationship between publishing and review. I want to wrap up, so I'll just say, the ideas here are pretty simple. We openly and totally transparently review papers already freely available online. We review papers continuously throughout their useful lifespan. Some papers are still used years and years later, and we don't even fully appreciate both their good and bad features until long after they were initially published. We think about reviews as something that's really fundamentally serving science and scientists, not just journals, as too often is the case today. We allow multiple groups to oversee review and curation, and we give scientists the opportunity to participate in review whenever they read a paper and feel like they have something worth saying. The goal of curation, which is sort of part of this, is ultimately we want to organize the literature to help people figure out what's useful, what they should be reading, what is provided value to the field, and so forth. There's all sorts of ways of thinking about curation and its different audiences that I think once we get past the idea that the only way we convey our judgment of papers is by putting them into journal bins, you start thinking about all sorts of new and creative ways to curate the literature that I hope we're about to see a wave come on. Right, so eLife, we're doing this now. This is sort of what we do as a journal. We review papers. We're kind of building tools to make that process easier and make it easier to interact with reviews, both from eLife and other organizations. But I hope that this is not just some sort of weird, quirky side part of science, and that this sort of takes off as the fundamental way that we assess papers. I want to end on just one final note, which is that, this system, will cost less if we do it right than the $10 billion we currently spend, but it will cost something. It's been obvious for a long time that subscriptions and paywalls are a terrible thing, but increasingly so are the page charges that we use for open access. I mean, I highlighted this before, in this audience where people don't have free money floating around like you often do in the medical sciences. The idea that you would spend $9,500 to publish a paper is just ludicrous. Like that, you should never, ever, ever, as a scientist, face a financial barrier to sharing your work with your colleagues. And so I think one other big thing we're trying to work on is that the only real good way, I think, to fund publishing is to start treating it like a utility, whose costs are borne centrally by the funders of science, and where nobody ever pays a cost to participate in the system. It's the only truly fair publishing system. Must involve zero cost for anybody, and it cannot involve any kinds of barriers to authors, readers, and users. And I really want to take questions, so I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can have a good discussion about these things and how to move forward. So thanks a lot. Awesome. So Cole, how should we handle these questions?
Thanks, that was great. So I will read off the top voted questions to you, and then if you can provide answers, that would be great.
So I assume answer them live.
Yep, exactly.
All right. Do you want me to read them?
I can read them out if that's all right.
Sure.
So first question, I find the issue, especially for students and scientists from developing countries, is that open access is not accessible due to the cost of publishing it, as you mentioned. So people are, quote, forced, unquote, to not opt for open access. Would love to hear your ideas on what we can do as ECRs to do something about this.
Yeah. So, I mean, I sort of hinted at the big picture thing, but it's been a huge problem for this. You know, when we started PLOS, we had an unshakable policy that if you couldn't afford to pay for your paper, you just tell us and we would publish your paper without cost. Like, our goal was kind of to tax the rich parts of science to run publishing without asking other people to participate. But that, that started to break down for all sorts of reasons, most notably that people started to look at open access journals as a way to make money, not as a way to communicate science. And that sadly was true at PLOS as well as other places. And so this kind of will publish anything, pay what you can kind of philosophy does not generally survive the encounter with the broader world. And so I think, for us, this was never meant as a permanent end game. It was just simply the only way there was to generate money to support a new system of publishing. We always sort of fundamentally believed that the future should be one where funders pay for publishing directly. And so I think it's time for us all to advocate strongly for such a model, to advocate for a model where there are no costs for publishing. I mean, some people will scream socialism, central control, blah, blah, blah. But like, this is the most socialized system in the world. It exists entirely on the basis of subsidies. It's just laundered subsidies, right? The money goes from funding agencies to universities and libraries. But at the end of the day, the money's coming from funding agencies and other supporters of science. We should just be upfront that we should come up with a fair way for them to collectively support the system, and it should be treated like a completely free utility for people to use. There's no other solution, and we should all start fighting strongly for that model.
That was great, thank you. And I know you kind of touched on this a little bit, but so the next question says, one could now perhaps generously view journals as curators of science, albeit with some issues. If we scrap journals, how do we do this curation service? It seems to me that in the absence of curation, pre-existing biases in the literature get accentuated. How do we replace the curation issue with an ever-expanding set of literature? Yeah.
So I mean, I think that the thing I worry about most in this post-journal world, which I hope we get to, is that the issue of bias, right? Like right now, you're already seeing things like people with the most Twitter followers or who are best at kind of getting people to pay attention online and social media and things are the ones who get the most attention for their science. And that is not the way it should work. And so, I think one model that we have been promoting but have had trouble getting instantiated, and where you, I think, all could kind of help see this through, is, scientific societies are a really good thing in their abstract manifestation. That is, as groups of scientists who work in a field who want to come together to promote science and scientists who are in their field. Unfortunately, most scientific societies have become captured by their publishing operations. They've become publishing businesses that run meetings on the side and do a few other things to kind of justify their existence. Just financially, they are dependent on their journals to operate. I think the way I think a very useful model is to reimagine the scientific society as an organization who views a kind of fundamental thing that it does is curate the literature in their field, to come up with systems where the members of their community participate in a process of curation, kind of analogous to the way they participate as editors or reviewers at a journal, but rather than viewing their remit as just whatever papers people happen to send to their journal and making sort of decisions about whether or not papers belong in their canon, to take on the task of curating in a equitable, fair, and useful way the literature in their field, that you would define, scientific societies are already largely defined by the science that people in the field do. So why not take on the mantle of curating the literature in their field and innovate in ways of doing it? I would love to see that be the way that scientific societies view their role as in science communication in a post-journal world. It's been very hard to get that to happen to date because they kind of have this catch-22 where they make so much of their money from journals that anything that threatens journals, they feel threatens their existence. So we do need to come up with a different funding model for this that is not dependent on journal subscriptions. But I think I think you have to have people managing the system, right? If you go to Reddit or something like that, you'll see the dangers and the benefits of good curating, a good, well-curated system of commentary and analysis, and places where they are totally free for all. We don't want the latter. We need the former. It's going to take time and effort and money, but we have that. We have the will. We just have to get this together. Yeah.
Awesome. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just pre-reading the question. Why don't you read it? So
okay. So the next question is, who should be responsible for changing the publishing system? Individual researchers / publishers, in my opinion, are not able to make a change. It is like going zero waste / plastic free. Some people / businesses will be determinate to do it, but many people will not want to change their convenient lifestyle only because it is the right thing to do. And then
yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of layers here. Like first of all, like, there's the individual action problem that, this needs to be a collective endeavor for it to work, right? Individual actions can help, posting preprints and things like that can move the world. But at the end of the day, if hiring decisions are made based on journals, if funding decisions are made based on journals, no rational scientist is gonna wanna completely shun such a system if that's the way that they feel like they have to advance their career. So I think, it's a kind of a double-headed thing. There has to be a lot of push to change the system. People have to be noisy and annoying and constantly talk about the problems. They have to seize the opportunities to change it when they present themselves. But at the end of the day, this has to come from above. Like, the funders and universities have to ultimately be pressured or take the initiative to change it. If the NIH said tomorrow that every paper every paper you put on a grant has to have been posted as a preprint, it would happen immediately. If they said that you have to participate in a system of post-publication peer review, it would happen immediately. Not because anybody is wholly married to one system or another, but just because they follow the lead of who funds them. And like, the biggest problem we've had here is that those institutions have been feckless. They've viewed this as a problem for someone else to solve, as something that they can respond to. And there's been vanishingly little leadership. It's starting to change. Some of the private funders in the US, at least, HHMI, Gates Foundation, others have started to take important steps in this direction. And the public funders in Europe, although they've made a lot of choices that I wouldn't have made in how they're doing it, they're at least recognizing that the future kind of a publishing needs to be shaped by funders to try to advance their funding mission. And so I'm optimistic that finally they're starting to realize that. That's happened less on the university side than it should. But I hope that as preprints take off, as these other models come into place, that these notably conservative and kind of I'll say a chicken shitted organization will start to move in the right direction. But I think that's how it has to work.
Great. So the next question says, have you come across the PCI initiative? And if so, what are your thoughts on that model?
Yeah, I think that they're doing everything right. Like, I love PCI is great. Like, they're basically trying to make this system real across all of science. I love what they're doing. It's like a lot of things. There's a little bit of a challenge, right? Like, in order to be successful, they need to recruit a lot of people to send papers to them. But in order to get people to send papers to them, they have to be successful. It's this, you're skating around the edges of a system that forces people to not that encourages people to not participate in new initiatives like this. So I love everything that they're doing. I think we need people to use it. Like, I think, I've always tried to, a lot of the decisions we've made in publishing, some of which I regret, have been kind of trying to balance this challenge of, when do we just radically start from scratch and when do we try to work within the existing system? And I think, they are kind of starting from first principles, and they're great. I think the challenge is just to make it work. So if everybody used PCI as a publishing system, we'd win. We'd be in a much better world. It's just it's the challenge we always face, is how do you get there? And I think, like, we're starting to think about how we can encourage more people to use PCI and other similar initiatives like it. And because, we can't be the only people who are doing this, and we're not. I mean, eLife isn't the first or the only group that's trying to do this. We're just trying to get people used to the idea and make it more, prominent and common part of parlance. So I hope that it succeeds. And I think when people feel like they're in a position where they can comfortably send papers to things like PCI and it won't cause them other troubles, I think they should, because it's great.
Awesome. So we still have some time, so I'm going to keep going, if that's all right.
Please.
So next question says, would be great to hear your thoughts on the debate surrounding whether or not to cite preprints before peer review.
I don't think there should be a debate here. I think it's obvious that you should cite work, right? Like, we use informal means of communication in science a lot. Like, like, I've been influenced repeatedly by ideas I've heard at meetings, talks, things I've heard in posts, things I've seen on posters, talks that people have given that never get published, right? Like, I don't see why, if you read something, it influences your thinking, you should of course cite it. Obviously, like, non-peer reviewed preprints, there's a little bit more of a burden on you to, as a author of a paper that's using information, to vet the information for your own purposes. But that's true for the published literature too. Like, I don't think there's any, like, you shouldn't be able to say, I cited this piece of information that was published in Nature, as if it was gospel, right? Like, we all should know that peer review is valuable, but not perfect. And so I don't see, just saying you should cite only published papers that have been peer reviewed is a cop-out to your responsibilities as a scientist to decide what is and isn't good and credible science to post. I think if you read a preprint, if a preprint influences your thinking, or if it has information that you think is pertinent to your science, it's incumbent upon you to read it and use it and cite it. That's not to say that you shouldn't do so with recognition that you're reading something that has a different history than a published paper, but certainly I think you have to cite it, just like you should cite a website if you use information from a database, or you download, right? You can download a genome from NCBI that's been unpublished, unpeer reviewed, unvetted. People do that all the time, and you wouldn't say you shouldn't do that or that you shouldn't cite it. It's like, that's just science. You cite where you get information from, and you don't treat anything as if it's gospel. So it's a debate that I think we shouldn't even sanction. It's just sort of, to me, it's obvious what the answer is.
Great. So I'll throw you one last question here. How do we deal with non-expert individuals, i.e. the press, that would like to popularize science with bioRxiv?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky thing, right? Because in some sense, this is out of our control, right? There is a danger, obviously, in putting out information, especially when it has to do with things that are of great interest to the public and media. I mean, nobody cares. Like if I publish something prematurely about fly development, it's very unlikely to generate much interest or cause problems. But obviously, if you publish a preprint that says that COVID vaccines are unsafe, or that COVID came from genetically engineered like viruses, like, right, there's a danger in the world that science can get picked up quickly. I don't think the solution is to say we should always be circumspect about what we share. I think that doesn't work either. I mean, the media picks up on published articles all the time without scrutiny. I think we do need some. I think we need systems in place that support a responsible media to help them vet information properly. But it's not, there's a lot of irresponsible media out there, and so I don't think the problem is created by preprints. I mean, that, right, like you've seen plenty of examples of misuse, both by authors and by the media and non-media kind of social media kind of people sharing information in published papers that is also irresponsible. We have a big problem with the relationship between scientific information and the media and the public. But I think, to the extent that we should play an important, we can't wash our hands of this problem. It's a real problem. We can't just say we're putting information out there, I don't care how it's used. I think, many of the problems are promoted by scientists. Like many of the worst examples of recent misuse of the scientific literature have been started by press releases from universities who kind of echo things that their scientists say, even if they're not sound. So we do have some role in curtailing that. But I also think, like, probably our biggest and most important thing we can do is to be more transparent about the different phases of scientific evaluation, to get the media, to stop both kind of reifying and sanctifying peer review, but also to kind of understand that everything, before you act on something, it needs to be scrutinized, and it needs to be scrutinized well. I think, on the plus side, some of the worst examples of kind of COVID misinformation that appeared in bioRxiv or medRxiv and then was picked up by the media, those articles were debunked within minutes in some cases, certainly hours and definitely days, right? The process of vetting and publicly assessing these works is really efficient and fast now. And I think one can hope, although probably it's a little bit naive to think that all corners of the media and world will start to appreciate that taking a little bit of time to see what the broader community thinks about a work is the way to treat it responsibly. That hasn't really happened yet. Like, we're still not there. But I think as the systems of public evaluation of preprints become more established and more recognized and more kind of institutional, perhaps that pause that currently takes place kind of behind closed doors and journals and so forth will happen more publicly, and people will appreciate that it behooves them to kind of just see what people think about a work before they take it. I don't. The real answer though is, science in any of its manifestations is playing in kind of a dangerous world. The modern media and social media is very difficult to control misinformation, and I don't think there are easy solutions to it. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all the great questions that were asked and for your great answers. We're now going to discuss the content of this presentation in a bit of a less formal setting.